In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of some of the radical social movements that start to take place in and around the English Civil War. The previous video spent some time talking about the Levellers. This lesson is going to spend some time talking about what were known as the quote-unquote true Levellers, the Diggers. Now, these were a radical agrarian movement that emerged in England, like I said, during the period of the Civil War, and were led by some particularly important leaders during this time. They were led following generally by an individual by the name of Gerard Winstanley, as well as William Everard. The Diggers sought to establish a society that was based on communal ownership of land and had quite strong religious foundations, but fundamentally were challenging the prevailing social and economic hierarchies that existed at the time in a similar way to the Levellers, but in a far more radical approach and an approach that is far more rooted in radical religious foundations than that of the Levellers, who of course were dealing with principles of English nationality and English nationalism and concepts that are associated more aligned with principles of liberalism that we might think of today. The Diggers were far more radical, and they were far more steeped in religious fervour than that of the Levellers. So central to this belief was a reinterpretation of Christian doctrine. Gerard Winstanley himself, very specifically, was their principal theorist and posited that the fall of man introduced the concepts of private property and subjugation. Some of you who know anything about theology might be looking at that with a raised eyebrow, but that's what the Diggers believed. For some of you who've studied theology, you might think, well, the fall of man brought about original sin, but I guess it also, according on this view, brings about the ideas of private property as well. According to the view of Winstanley, Christ's teachings aimed to restore the state to a sense of communal harmony, and this could be exemplified in certain early Christian communities described in the Book of Acts, for example. And I've cited here on screen the Book of Acts, quote, "And all that believed were together and had all things common." This is a basic quote from the Bible, from the Book of Acts, and this is one of those quotes that Winstanley would use to identify the idea of the teachings of Christ bringing about communal harmony. Winstanley himself identified God with reason and Christ with the spirit of universal liberty. So a quite religious, wacky theory. You don't need to know too much about the sort of theological foundations of the Diggers. It's really too niche of a part of the specification. It only makes up about a page and a half in the main textbook, for example. So don't feel like don't get too stressed out about not having a proper understanding of all the real theological and religious foundations. I'm just adding this here for anybody who might want to slip maybe a bit of biblical quotation as part of your specific evidence in an essay, but it probably isn't very necessary given just how niche the Diggers are as part of the specification more broadly. So, in terms of their socio-political critique, specifically the Diggers' ideology was a response to some of the socio-economic upheavals that existed in their time. They contended, for example, that the English Civil War had been fought not only against monarchical tyranny, but also and against the oppressive structures that had been upheld by landowners and the aristocracy, the political nation, if you want to draw that kind of connection and link and comparison. And so when we see the execution of Charles I, the Diggers believed that it was imperative to, this act itself, the regicide itself, was imperative to address some of these systematic inequalities that came as the result of things like land enclosures and private ownership. Winstanley himself was a particularly meticulous individual in terms of the tracing of the injustices and his sort of doctrinal critiques, in the sense that he traced the origins of these injustices all the way back to the Norman conquests back in 1066, and argued that William the Conqueror had dispossessed the English of their ancestral rights, and he referred to this historical grievance as the quote-unquote Norman yoke, suggesting that the true liberation required the dismantling of the remnants of feudal society and the legacy of feudalism. So if we move slightly away from the theoretical terms and the theoretical ideas and the sort of thinking about theological implications and sort of talking about some of the high-minded ideas of what the Diggers actually advocated for, and focusing a little bit more on the practicality, the pragmatics of their policies and their ideas, the Diggers envisioned a society that was devoid of private property, that was devoid of monetary transactions, and that was devoid of hierarchical governance. They instead proposed that land be cultivated collectively with its produce stored in communal repositories available to all. For those of you who are studying A-level politics and have been going through studying political ideas, you might think that this is particularly familiar. This is a bit like socialism or anarchism in a way, the idea of collective ownership, communal ownership, the abolition of private property, very much ideas and concepts that are associated with Marxist and anarchist principles, but doing so a few hundred years before. Ultimately, like I said, the Diggers drew inspiration from a number of quite radical English movements, and of course identified the Norman conquests as their sort of the starting point of all of their woes, so to speak. In terms of their inspiration, they noted things like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and they echoed sentiments like those of John Ball, who once questioned societal hierarchies with rhetorical inquiry, for example. And fundamentally, in terms of the work that they would actually go about doing, let's just say, they established themselves at St. George's Hill. On the 1st of April 1649, Winstanley and Everard and a small group of other followers began cultivating the common land at St. George's Hill in Surrey. Their actions of doing so were both quite symbolic, but also seen as quite practical, because they aimed to demonstrate the viability of communal agrarian lifestyles. So essentially they were trying to practice what they preach, and show the world, or show at least England or Britain, what the value was of their particular ideas. Of course, you could probably imagine that their activities quickly drew attention and also quickly drew quite a bit of concern. Local landowners, for example, viewed the occupation, in quote-unquote, as a threat to private property rights and the social order. I guess you could probably argue that they were correct, that this was a threat to private property rights, given that the Diggers were looking to dig in order to abolish private property. Reports to the Council of State described the group as a disorderly and tumultuous sort of people, and a number of orders eventually led to their dispersal. So they were sort of trying to operate as a sort of bit of a protest movement, if you will. Now, despite the fact that they did have peaceful intentions, by all accounts, they were radical in the views that they espoused, but they weren't necessarily radical in their resort to violence, for example, in achieving those views. Despite these peaceful intentions, then, the Diggers did face escalating hostility, as you can probably imagine. They were subjected to legal actions, to physical assaults, and to the destruction of property. In one specific instance, a number of organised men, organised by local landowners, started attacking the Diggers, burning their homes and destroying their crops. In August 1649, they were forced to abandon St. George's Hill and relocate somewhere else nearby to Copham Heath. Interesting, though, that they started their cultivation project in April 1649 and managed to last all the way until August, so a good few months of cultivating that they did. But they would continue to face persecution, as you can imagine, including attacks led by people like Parson John Platt, who was the local lord of the manor, and these ultimately led to the dissolution of the Digger communities by April 1650. And so when we think about their legacy in terms of thinking about social changes during the English Civil War, although quite a short-lived group, their experiment in communal living did leave a lasting impact. Winstanley himself, though, would continue to advocate for social reform through a number of publications. So even though the diggers' communities were basically done by April 1650, in 1652, for example, Winstanley would publish the Law of Freedom in the Plantation, or in a plantation, should I say, which outlined his vision for a society that was based on equality and communal ownership. And so it was a movement that really emphasized social justice, if you will, and communal living. And of course, their legacy endures, but more specifically for our purposes, in terms of understanding the English Civil War, you can see the similarities between the Levellers and the Diggers, and you can see and trace the origins of these different kinds of movements, why these movements came about, how these movements came about, and thinking about the English Revolution, the English Civil War, the establishment of a republic as not only a political event, but as also a deeply social event that has quite a lot of very key, important ideas and conceptualizations, all of which is very important. And we'll carry on as we go through the rest of these lessons talking about some of the social changes that takes place. And in fact, the final lesson on Stuart Britain will concern ourselves by looking at what the political nation actually looked like by 1702. So all of this does interconnect and is particularly relevant. So I hope to see everybody back in the next lesson, where we'll talk about some more issues concerning this sort of quite tumultuous period of the English Civil War.